One of the things I'd like to talk about that's also misunderstood is these concepts. I'm going to call them variability and etiology, and I'll explain what that means. Etiology is just a word. It kind of means what causes it, and people are always really interested in, like, well, how did this happen? What caused it? And then this concept of variability is addiction doesn't always manifest in everybody exactly the same. There's a great deal of variability in the rate of the progression of this phenomenon, and also in just how does it manifest. So I'll work with the etiology first. You know, there's a lot of theories out there that addiction's caused by this. And what's interesting is that there's some truth really to most of these theories, that there's something going on, and we notice that in a certain population that when this event or when this phenomenon is present, that we see this addiction forming. The problem is that for every case that you could say, like, say for instance trauma, there's a camp that says all addiction is caused by trauma. And if you're working with opiate-addicted females in certain, populations, IV use opiates in the right area, for example, you might find that you're mostly right, perhaps, and yet not all opiate addicts, even, or all addicts, period, have experienced any kind of trauma. So, in some cases, you might find an individual with addiction who talks about how great their upbringing was. They had positive role models. They were the captain of the whatever team, or whatever. They had good self-esteem, and they just really liked to get high. They liked drinking or doing whatever else it was, and they just really enjoyed it. And over time, it kind of spun out of control. And so that kind of flips on the head that all addiction is caused by trauma or other mental issues. It's all just coping with something else, but that doesn't mean that those aren't factors, and they aren't important in helping us understand addiction. The one common thing in etiology of addiction is pleasure. For whatever reason, the individual found it more pleasurable than other people, and had the right physiology in order to allow this particular adaptation to take place. So it's the physiology that allows the adaptation to take place, and then some other factors that coalesce together. Now, if I didn't feel comfortable in my own skin, say, for example, and I use a substance and that relieved me from that sensation, well, it's likely that I would perceive that as being more pleasurable than somebody that didn't have that experience. So certainly trauma, anxiety, depression, etc., certainly can be significant components in the formation of addiction, but most people with traumas, depression and anxiety will never develop addiction, even though they have exposure to intoxicating substances. So it can't just be that this A causes B, that it's this coalescing together of these factors, a mix between genes and environment. And environment doesn't just include I have depression, or I have negative life experiences, or there wasn't a lot of hope where I was, or all of these other factors that can kind of join together and coalesce together to help develop this phenomenon. But it also has to do with, like, how do I perceive that? Like, some people can perceive the exact same phenomenon and not be as distressed by it, for example. And so it's my own temperament in how I process information and experiences, coupled with what are those experiences, coupled with my own genetic code, that has to all come together in just the right way in order for this neuro adaptation to take place. And it's interesting, we can't ever go in and pinpoint, well, what is the ratio of all of these things? And I think it's probably even really impossible to even necessarily capture all the different components that come together, that coalesce together in this neuroadaptive change. And in the end, it really doesn't matter, because addiction is a primary disorder. What that means is I can't go back and fix whatever those things were and have it go away, because the neuroadaptation has already taken place. I can't fix something that's already transpired and then expect to undo all the neuroadaptation, which is really what the addiction is. And sometimes there's some confusion about this. And this is important for family members too, because a lot of times family members want to blame themselves, like they're solely responsible for it. And there is, people and their families and relationships, a lot of stuff happens there, and And in some cases, it certainly is a contributing factor, but it's not the cause. And this is important to understand, and understanding the primary aspect of addiction too, because I can't go back and undo something and somehow not have to deal with this anymore. Now, this is also important in if there is these other factors like depression, anxiety, the way that I cognitively process certain events and situations that are different than other people and they cause me distress that made intoxication more pleasurable, then part of being sober and expecting that this to be a long-term, to reap the long-term benefits of that, then I'm probably going to have to go back and revisit that stuff. That's not necessarily a bad thing. And in fact, that oftentimes is the gift of addiction. That sometimes, arguably most of the time, when people recover from addiction, they're forced to face things that cause them to distress before the addiction took place. And this isn't, even if it was an insignificant factor, this is generally true with people, that there's these things that have never been faced that cause distress, and whether it was part of the ideology for that individual or not, part of the recovery is going to be facing those things. And why I think this is important is human beings who aren't addicts experience these things as well. And what often happens is that we develop workarounds, like ways of avoiding certain situations or labeling things good or bad, or doing other ways of kind of doing workarounds so that we can go through life and never face these things that cause us distress. And people that recover from this particular phenomenon don't really have any choice. They actually have to go back and address things that people wouldn't normally address. And interestingly, this makes their quality of life better than it would have been often had they never experienced the phenomenon of addiction. And it tends to make their relationships have the capacity to be far better than they would be if it wasn't for the addiction. And that's one thing family members with people in long-term sobriety notice, who have been with them through the whole thing, is I didn't get my old person back. I usually get somebody better back. And that's why I kind of call it this, addiction brings a gift in recovery. As far as variability goes, it doesn't always look the same. There's what I call early onset rapid progression recovery, where the individual has a strong genetic component, and probably some of the other factors like not feeling comfortable in their own skin, where they start using substances and they're full-blown addiction within weeks or months, and experience tragic disruptions in a very short period of time. Where there's other people where this progression, it's a progressive disorder, takes place over decades, and in some cases never really reaches the end stage that some other individuals can hit in under 6 months. It's still the same phenomenon, and in the end, the neuro adaptation is the same. That there's all these cognitive processes, these structural and cognitive processes take place. The distortion, the inability to perceive risk and benefit, pleasure, the whole 9 yards is the same in the end. The rate at which an individual gets there is different, and then the manifestation. Some people are going to be daily users and use all the time and just be fully out of the control. Other people are going to be more controlled in their use, but they're going to have more sporadic use. It's going to be this explosive intermittent using pattern with maybe some shame followed by preoccupation and kind of this, recreating the thing that they said they wouldn't do. And in the end, it really doesn't matter. It's similar. It's the same brain physiology. Acknowledging that there's a problem and then developing a long-term solution that adequately addresses that this is a chronic condition that needs to be managed like other chronic conditions do is still what needs to be done. And assigning blame really isn't helpful in that matter. Understanding some factors that are going to be a problem as part of somebody's recovery is important.